And welcome to Nacht Waffen Pilot with Penny Bradley. And tonight we have the, did I say the number one hit wonder himself, the one that can make you wonder if you're really going to Mars or not, or whatever planet you want to go to, because he's probably going to take you there if you're not insane. The Douglas Dietrich. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Douglas, Penny, have fun.
Thank you, Daryl. Welcome. I think we discussed earlier this week about talking about Asia and the situations there and kind of how we got here.
Mm-hmm.
You have the background for that, and I have general knowledge, but not the background to give details. So wherever you want to start, even if you want to go back to the colonial era.
Oh, that's so wonderful. I really appreciate that. And I was hoping for a bit more of a parameter or envelope or frame in which to work, but I'm happy to take it anywhere, that you wish.
Okay. We are in a situation where the three major powers of the planet are eyeballing each other with nuclear weapons. And it's getting more and more nerve-wracking to watch. And the majority of the people are clueless. They have no idea that part of what we're fighting over are silicon chips being made in Taiwan.
Yes.
So,
and I think that's, go on.
Okay. What I was taught in school was so perfunctory that it's ridiculous. They basically made it sound like that Taiwan had no existence before the Portuguese got there, which they called it Formosa. So, I figured out a long time ago that what I had been taught was a bunch of crap. And so, I have a nodding acquaintance with that the British came into Hong Kong and created a sphere of influence and created the opium wars to control the opium trade, which, by the way, the United States now controls it, or at least the CIA. And so this has been an ongoing, 500 years of sheer bullshit that's been going on in Asia, where Europeans or North Americans are interfering with the lives of the people who are native there. And these were long-term developed civilizations, at least on a par with Europe when the Europeans showed up.
Yes, very much so. And I want to thank you for your explaining that. First off, I want to basically have you go on just a little bit while I gather my head together and pull my head out of my ass, because I always want to remind everyone that when we conduct these interviews, it is the middle of my biological night, and I actually have a situation in which I kind of like am sleep talking as opposed to sleepwalking. And definitely one of the things that I want to do is do justice to the topic. Of course, it is, after all, my topic. But what you've outlined is kind of like the American ignorance on the topic, and that's very important. It is something that I don't think is, very much does anything justice. You started with Taiwan, and I love you for that. And people don't understand the importance of Taiwan at all. So when we come to the chips and we come to the manufacturing, hopefully I could do that some justice. And I want people to understand that, first off, we live in a situation where much of your world depends on computer chips. And because they depend on computer chips, you have no idea just how ubiquitous they are. And yet, how very few people manufacture them, and why Taiwan is so important to you, and why you
Yeah.
may go to war over Taiwan. Okay, I'm getting my head together. I'm getting it out of my
Good.
ass. So I'm breathing something. A little bit more oxygen is coming into my brain, and if only I had enough cocaine and alcohol to put me into the position where
That's
I
a bad
normally am
combo.
when I speak at my program. And I do want to remind people that tomorrow night, this is important. I want people to understand Penny saves my ass whenever I'm like this on my own program. And I bring her onto my program, and she helps me buy time. She helps me burn bandwidth, and she's very wonderful about it. She's very gracious
I
about it.
sit there and I chat with his producer, his version of Daryl here, and his Jameson is an interesting character all on his own.
Oh yeah, yeah,
And
and wonderful human being. Of course, he
yes,
deals with challenges, and
don't we
uh,
all?
yeah, yes, we all do. And so one of the things that I want people to understand is we have very little time, comparatively speaking. I'm gonna, now that I've got myself wound up and I've talked enough to,
Have
yeah,
just under 2 hours.
just under 2 hours. So I'm gonna get started now.
Instead of the 12-hour stretch that you have on your own show.
Yes, yes, and
So
if anyone hears that noise, I'll unplug the external hard drive, because strangely enough, the external hard drive makes noise every once in a while when it's just positioned and it tries to assert itself. So let me take that out. All these
well,
computers.
I have the swamp cooler going overhead.
Okay, no worries, no worries.
It's been over 100 degrees here, and the swamp cooler is staying on.
Okay, so let's go a little bit into how we got here, but first we need to describe what's going on now to say how we got here, because a lot of people don't understand what's going on.
Yeah, a lot of folks have.
now.
All they know is they have heard that Trump was influenced by the Russians, and they have heard that Biden was accused of being influenced by the Chinese, and that's all they know about the situation.
Okay, well let's put this to rest. First off, the Democrats are just as hard on Red China as the Republicans are. They know that much, that the one thing they have to do is they cannot look weak before Red China. So you don't need to worry yourselves about that. And so when it comes to this thing about Biden, Fox News feels that it's a political plus to continually hit Biden about somehow being weak on China, and that's just not the case. And rather the situation that we need to worry about instead is what can be done about China, and everybody is pretty much united on that across the political spectrum. We don't need to create further divisions in that regard concerning the common enemy. And so the common enemy is indeed Red China for right now, and people need to understand that it is most certainly the enemy, and it is the enemy that is the only real challenge to the United States. You talk about 3 nuclear superpowers, and by that, of course, you're thinking, I presume, about Russia and China and America, right? Correct me if I'm wrong on that, please.
I was thinking the survivor states from the Soviet Union,
Right, okay.
still as an allied group.
Still as an allied group. Okay, well, just bear this in mind. Okay, that those days are over, so everybody understands that, and I don't think enough people do. Here is the greatest problem that we have. When it comes to most of our listeners right now, many of them are consumers of alternative media. So this is what we are. We are all alternative media. There is a there is a problem with alternative media in that everybody's pretty much tired of mass media and establishment media, which is undoubtedly and undeniably to the left. It is very left in the spectrum, and whereas in the old days, and it's pretty pretty much still like this. You could say that television was the mass dominant form of media that gripped pretty much everybody, and it was very left leaning and had been since the days of Nixon and the 60s. And then the radio was very much the alternative media because people took to the radio who were conservative. And when the conservative...
There was a law change in the Reagan administration that made it where we no longer... The mainstream no longer had to give equal time to opposing viewpoints.
Understood. And
so those folks, folks that were suddenly shut out.
Right.
Radio.
Yeah. And my point being that bandwidth is very much along those lines. So this is pretty much an extension of the radio media. And I want everyone to know that there is a problem here. And the problem is that there is a need to push a certain kind of perspective. And when it comes to Eastern Europe, just to get that out of the way, I want people to know that there was a very anti-Ukrainian perspective that was promoted on the radio and electronic media as opposed to mass media, which is mostly television and the establishment media. And the anti-Ukrainian perspective was promoted by the Russians. And because the Russians have disintegrated as a superpower and honestly never really were a superpower, and what I can do is recommend people to listen to myself tomorrow night for that. I will go into a bit of Russia tomorrow night because tomorrow night on my own program, which is Critical Omissions, and that begins on YouTube at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That'll be 5 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Tune in tomorrow night on YouTube for that. You just need to look up Douglas Dietrich. It is literally...
it's literally Douglas Dietrich.
Yeah, so if you look up Douglas Dietrich on YouTube, you're going to find it. And honestly, in our program, our promotional for tonight's program, I actually put the exact address up there for people to connect to. And that, of course, just so everybody knows, it's youtube.com/C/Douglas Dietrich. So, that's easy. youtube.com/C/Douglas Dietrich. And I'll talk about Russia tomorrow night because tomorrow is the anniversary of the commencement of the Spanish Civil War. So I'm obligated to speak about the Spanish Civil War, which the fascists won, and I will explain why that's a good thing. Now to get back to where we are, and where we are, of course, is, basically, let's take a look at the UFO dump. That'll bring us back to Asia. There's been a UFO info dump by the Pentagon, and that UFO info dump relates directly to two things. And this has nothing to do with self-indulgence or some kind of bizarre delusion. This is reality. It has to do with the release of my book. My book is co-authored by Peter Moon, and I do recommend people read it. It is The Roswell Deception and the Demystification of World War II. There is a little chicken shit fiction book, a novel out there by the name The Roswell Deception. That will probably be the first thing you'll find if you look it up on the internet. So you have to use the subtitle as well, The Roswell Deception and the Demystification of World War II. If you want to find out about the background of Asia and how we got here, that'll give you an in-depth start. But when Peter Moon and I released this book, which is out now, and ask your bookstore to carry it. If they can't carry it, then go to skybooks.usa.com. That's www.skybooks.usa.com and order yourself a copy. And believe me, you'll want one. So they released a massive info dump on UFOs to try and obfuscate what we expose in that book. And so that's important. The other thing that it brings us back to Asia with is, of course, the challenge of what we're looking at. Obviously, these UFO dumps show, as Penny, Bradley, and I can attest, and we're not going to go there right now, but she and I stand shoulder to shoulder, and we can tell you this. The 1,000-year Reich in exile is behind the majority of these UFO sightings. There are other types of UFOs.
The ones that aren't are mostly Solar Warden, which is American.
Right. She's talking about a private company in contract to the Department of Defense, etc. So we can go into that another time. I know that people
Yeah.
have brought that up with me before, and that's something I'm less familiar with, but that's not something that I deny. That's not something that I deny. That is how the Americans would work with contracts. That's okay. So, but what most people see when they look at the footage is they think aliens. Okay, there's a few different types of right. Well, there are a few organic looking manifestations of ufological phenomenon, and these are organic. The ones that look organic are organic, totally different subject. And then there's the extra dimensional factor or extra temporal factor, again, a rather different subject. However, the more mechanistic looking phenomenon is almost certainly, as she says, a American contract technology, or the Thousand-Year Reich in exile, meaning the Third Reich as reestablished in Unterland, which is not a hollow earth. If you want to know about that, go to DouglasDietrich.com and look up the Nexus Magazine articles that we have published on DouglasDietrich.com on the website. So that would be at www.DouglasDietrich.com. Look up Nexus Magazine articles, and then you will find out what Unterland is. It is not a hollow earth. The earth is not hollow. Okay, so all of that out of the way. People take a look at this and they say, oh my God, what is that shit? Oh, that's really high technology. How long would it take us to catch up? And okay, well, that brings us back to China. Look at the example of communist China on the mainland. Communist China had its first nuclear test in 1964. Now, do, of course, understand a nuclear fission weapon involves purifying uranium isotopes and getting critical mass. The United States, of course, and all the Axis powers which preceded them, both Germany and Japan, had nuclear weapons first. And yes, they did fucking use them, okay? You will find out about that by reading the Roswell Deception. I'm sorry?
The German nukes were captured by the Americans, and the nukes that the Americans dropped on Japan were the German nukes. They had any of their own at that point.
Right. Yes. Okay. So let me explain this just without going too deeply into that. Just to clarify, Penny Bradley is absolutely right. I can tell you, as a Department of Defense research librarian, to clarify what she says, or rather to qualify what she says. She's absolutely correct. But to qualify what she says, the Hiroshima bomb, which is the little boy bomb, which is a much thinner nuke, that is a Axis uranium ordnance, standardized and mass-produced Axis uranium ordnance. Many of those were produced in North Korea, where the Japanese, of course, had Korea as a colony. All the Korean peninsula was occupied by Japan. All of Manchuria was occupied by Japan, and North Korea is seething with uranium. That's how they get enough uranium to do their chicken shit little nuclear tests, which are all based on Japanese World War II technology, which they're only now beginning to advance a bit beyond. And of course, that is meant to fit in the fuselage of a medium bomber, which would be a suicide delivery mechanism, and that is the little boy bomb. That was what was dropped on Hiroshima. That is why it was not tested. That was because the Americans knew it would work, because the Germans deployed one at Kurland. That's spelled Courland. The Germans spell it with a K, K-U-R, and no O, Kurland. Kurland was where the Germans deployed it to disintegrate the Soviet advance, and the Germans retained Kurland even after the fall of Berlin. And this was because, of course, they were evacuating as many civilians as they could from the Baltic nations of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. These were all part of the ancient German order of the Teutonic Knights, which had helped to establish those nation states, and therefore these were Germanic peoples, and that was the largest evacuation in all recorded human history. That was Operation Hannibal. That was run by Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, and this is why when Adolf Hitler evacuated, Karl Dönitz was made the Führer of the Third Reich in his place with Hitler gone. And Karl Dönitz, Yes. So that being said, let's take a look at the Axis, which had these nuclear weapons in 1944. The United States had them in 1945, meaning that it did produce its own domestic nuke, but that was the plutonium program, which is the fat boy bomb. It's American, right? That's why it's fat. So, can't resist that. Just had to get that out there. And, but, the fat man, yes,
I'm
that's so
sorry.
apropos. Yes, that is the one that was dropped on Nagasaki. And so the first Soviet test was not until 1949. So when communist China was trying to get its own atomic bomb, it was getting help from the Soviet Union. Now, bear in mind, the only reason that communist China, some geopolitics for you, here's some facts. Do remember that the original Security Council of the United Nations, and again, some clarification here, just so you understand, read my book for the details, and you can go in depth there into the history. But for right now, you can look this up your own, and you'll find out that I'm right. You can look up the United Nations honor flag. They call it an honor flag. If you look up the United Nations honor flag, you'll find that it was flying in 1944, 45 throughout the war. This is, of course, a special white flag with 4 red stripes on it, 4 vertical lines. That was meant to signify Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 4 freedoms. That was the flag of the United Nations, their battle flag. Okay, that was meant so that any resistance fighter, Filipino or French resistance, whatever in the world, Europe or Asia, anywhere on Earth where they needed help from the United Nations, and the United Nations was flying in supplies or special forces, then they could whip out a white sheet, any white sheet, a bed sheet, and then use their own blood if necessary to paint 4 red stripes. That way, the United Nations would know they were on their side. The United Nations was established where I worked, at the Presidio military base, in January 1st of 1942. It is not a peace organization established in 1945. It is by its own charter, which you can look this up. The United Nations does not have a constitution. It has a charter, and by its own charter, it is Title 42 of the UN Charter. It is an organization of war. It was an organization of war meant to fight the Axis powers. It is still at war with the Axis powers. The sole recognized Axis power on the surface of the earth today being my homeland and my heartland, the island nation on which I was born, island China, Taiwan. That is recognized as the last Nazi state on earth. We actually swear in our official political oaths or our sports salutes. We use the ad locutio. That is the Roman salute. It is what you Westerners think of as the Heil Hitler salute. That is our salute in Taiwan. We use that for swearing an oath upon entering office or taking a position of responsibility before sporting events in Taiwan, etc. That is our salute. And again, you'll see the Taiwanese military using that salute. Again, that is the ad locutio. We are a Nazi government. We are the last Nazi government on earth, the surface of the earth.
The Locutio goes back way, 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 all the way to Rome, and has been used by all sorts of folks in between.
Yes, of course. And the reason it was brought back by the Italian fascists and, of course, the German National Socialists and other powers that were aligned with them was because of the American incepted so-called Spanish flu. The so-called Spanish flu was the American Army and Navy flu, which was incepted in the United States. Bear this in mind, all flus are avian flus, all flus are swine flus, and all flus are Asian flus. This is just to get that out of the way briefly, because all of the world's sustenance farming for the majority of the world's population, the overwhelming majority of the world's population being in Asia, all of the subsistence farming in Asia centers on pigs and chickens in particular, and the pigs and chickens live in proximity with the subsistence farmers. And for this reason, do remember that viruses, which evolved in the intestinal tracts of dinosaurs, later on went to their, well, what dinosaurs eventually degenerated into, which are birds, like, chickens. This is why when you look at Science Channel and they say, oh, can we recreate a dinosaur or make a dinosaur? They turn to chickens. So that's one of their first thoughts. So the whole point is that the viruses that come out of the chickens wind up infecting the pigs, which have very similar properties to human beings. In other words, you can use pig valves to replace human heart valves. If you've had a heart valve replacement, you're given a choice between a pig valve or a human valve. And since you're, by human valve, I mean man-made valve, like an artificial.
When you're getting transplants, they're not always from a human being. Sometimes they are from a pig.
Yes.
We are that close.
We're that close. That's right.
We are closer genetically to pigs than we are to other monkey type animals.
Right, and that's why hence the avian swine flu. So it goes from the avians to the pigs to the human beings who eat them, and that is why all flus are Asian flus. Now, the so-called Spanish flu was the only flu that incepted out of Asia, that was not in Asia, it was not coming out of Asia, not emergent out of Asia, but rather something from outside of Asia. And this is, of course, totally unnatural. That's because it was generated here in the United States. And so when it was...
it came originally from Kansas City.
That's right.
Where we're burning refuse from a military base and from the packing yards, and that the process created it. Although that I have the personal feeling that science was more advanced than that, and that they had actually done this on purpose.
Yes, they did. They did. What happened was they forcibly drafted conscripts out of San Quentin prison in California and put them in boxcars. Remember, there was no refrigeration in those days.
Yeah.
They put them in boxcars with live chickens, and en route to Kansas, the cantonments where they would be putting the military bases together, they were forced to inhale all that pulverized and powderized particulate matter from the chickens, their shed feathers, their chicken shit, and that's how they incepted the American Army and Navy flu. And so when they brought them into Kansas, they made certain they were breathing in all that burning crap so that they could further incept it and incubate it, and therefore turned all of these men into an incubator for the original H1N1, hemagglutinin 1, neuromodase 1, American Army and Navy flu. It was called the Spanish flu because Spain was a nominally neutral country that America had defeated in the Spanish-American War, which brings us back to Asia because that's how America conquered the Philippines, which was a Spanish colony. And of course, because the Americans conquered Spain, really, literally almost conquered Spain, they seriously considered annexing Spain, not just the Philippines as a territory.
That was the mindset at the time.
Yes. And so because
they were still in the mindset of manifest destiny. If we conquered it, it's ours.
Mm-hmm. And because they had not invaded Spain, but were on the precipice of doing so because they had all of its colonies, Spain was next. Spain offered them a kind of coordinated or compelled surrender, and the Americans left them neutral, sans all of the majority of their overseas colonies, if they allowed the Americans to disembark their troops in future wars in Europe. And so the Americans paid them something like $20 million at the time, the equivalent of $20 billion today, in kind of reparations, so that they could expedite this. And then in World War I, they disembarked all these sick troops there. They arrived in what were called coffin ships, and that's because almost all of them arrived dead. The survivors were vectors of this horrible disease, and when they jumped into the trenches next to their British and French allies, they infected everybody, including the Germans, and 100 million people died worldwide. Ultimately, 200 million were impacted because another 100 million had their lives shortened by 10 to 15 years because of lung damage from the so-called Spanish flu. That's how it got the name Spanish flu, but it was incepted in America. It's totally unnatural, and it's a bioweapon. And this is what they're suspecting about Wuhan. Totally different subject, not interested in that. We're not going to go there because it doesn't matter whether it came out of a lab or whether it came out of nature. It came out of Asia, which means that it's that's where all the flus come from anyway. So it's kind of a stupid point to ask if it's artificial when it's coming out of Asia, because eventually something would have come out of Asia, whether they were developing it or not. So, but if you're really interested, if you
that does sound kind of that R word that people throw at me.
which R word is that?
The racist.
Oh God, that's I'm Asian. I can get away with it.
I don't.
Okay. I'll cover it.
Go there.
Yeah. Okay, I'll cover it briefly, just so people understand. And this brings us back to Europe and the ad locutio and that Hitler salute. That the reason the Italians and the Germans and all the fascists did that was because they knew the Americans had ended World War I by just killing everybody, and nobody was able to wage war anymore because all the young men were dying and they couldn't go to the front, and they couldn't have enough young men to produce in the factories any of the munitions needed at the front. So with everybody dying, everybody had to stop the war. That's how World War I stopped. Well, because of that,
it was.
Yes, and because of that, the Nazis who came afterwards, the fascists who came afterwards, they made certain to say, hey, let's learn from the Asians because the Asians bow. This is why Asians bow, so they don't spread germs to each other because, it's filthy to shake hands. That's how people spread germs, by human contact. It all comes from the hands. That's why you're not supposed to scrub your eyes or pick your nose and, your ass and your ears when you might be giving yourself and other people something. So to prevent that, nobody touches each other. Everybody in Asia bows when they meet. So in Europe, they said, let's return to the Roman salute. That's why the Heil Hitler came back into play. That's how that salute came about, so that they wouldn't touch each other. So Americans, of course, are filthy and they just keep shaking each other's hands. That stopped now. And, couldn't happen to a nicer group of people. But all of this is because, just remember this much, when it came to what happened with the avian swine flu, just to cover that, if you want to know how Wuhan flu or the Kung flu, how the latest communist Chinese flu came about, it was the fucking Russians. And what happened was they were deploying, and you can look this up, weaponized African swine flu. There is no argument here. The African swine flu was weaponized by the Soviet Union, and the Russians have continued to weaponize it ever since. They maintain arsenals of African swine fever. So they tried to deploy it in the Ukraine. You can look up a map of all of the outbreaks of African swine flu in the former Soviet Union and its satellite states. And so in order to defeat the Ukraine, they tried to starve it out by killing their pig population, which was the primary source of protein. Of course, this spread without control and got into China. That's what killed China's pig population. You can look this up yourself. And what happened was recently, I'm talking about like not World War II, I'm talking about like literally last year, the year before then, for the past 3 years, what happened was the African swine fever got into China, and China, their only source of protein for all intents and purposes is pigs. China raises so many pigs that when all their pigs died off, they ordered all the available pigs the rest of the world had to offer. Just everything the Brazilians could sell, every pig the Americans could sell. The communist Chinese tried to buy it all. And because of that, they depleted everybody's pork supplies. There was a pork shortage worldwide. And still, all of the world's available pigs put together come up to just a fraction of what the communist Chinese pig die-off was. All of the world's pigs, for all intents and purposes, 90% of the world's pigs are raised in China. And that is their major source of protein. So when they ran out of pigs and had no pigs, certainly not enough to replace them anywhere near that, because the Russian weaponized African swine fever killed them all off, then they ate anything available, including the national animal, which was the panda. And so they brought them all into what are called wet markets. They brought bats, pangolins, everything you can imagine, rats that they could bring into the wet markets so that people could have something to eat. And in these wet markets, that seething cesspit of all of this combined animal mass, this biomass, was where that flu erupted out of. It happened because bats are the normal vectors, happened with bat droppings from one cage dropping onto a pangolin below it, and the pangolin incepted the Wuhan flu. This is in Wuhan, in the wet markets of Wuhan, and that's why the pangolin flu had a 99% DNA matchup with the Wuhan flu, with the COVID-19. So it definitively came from a pangolin, which got it from a bat. So that is the new variant of the avian swine flu, only it wasn't the normal avian swine flu because all the pigs were dead. Killed off by the fucking Russians with their accidental spread because it's very difficult to control the spread of biological weapons. That tells you how we got here in a big way, because now that the Chinese have no food, no pigs for protein, then they have to go into the South China Sea to fish. This is why they're overfishing in the South China Sea, and why they're sending masses of all of these fishing ships into the Philippines and everywhere else, and why they're having direct confrontation with the Philippines, which brings the Americans back into direct confrontation with communist China, is because they have no food at home, and so they're overfishing the South China Sea and stealing food from everybody else and coming into direct contact with the Filipinos. Does that make sense?
Got it. Into contact with the Filipinos, with the
everyone.
Okinawans, with the Taiwan,
Japanese, everyone. Yeah, Taiwanese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Indonesia. Yes.
And I've been watching these reports because I don't read American mass media. I read other countries' mass media.
Good.
And,
so is what I'm saying coherent? You follow what I'm saying?
I'm following what you're saying, and it's mostly consistent with what I've been reading. For the audience, I read Al Jazeera, I read Press TV, or did before the United States shut down their website, and I read something called Irrawaddy News.
Fabulous. Irrawaddy is like the rice paddies in South Asia and the Malayan realm, all of Monsoon Asia. That's Irrawaddy Asia. Yes, fabulous. And so basically that helps you understand not just the Nazi salute, it also helps you understand. Now, you might ask, okay, so how is Taiwan the last Nazi power? How did they become Nazified? Why does the United Nations, quote unquote, tolerate it? And why don't they come in and invade like they would Panama or any place else? Okay, I'll try and get to that. Taiwan is
if I remember correctly, the United States has a treaty that they will protect Taiwan.
There is not a formal treaty. Rather, the United States claims that Taiwan is under military law. In other words, they claim that military governance is what rules Taiwan, the U.S. military governance, because this is how...
So they're claiming to be occupying Taiwan.
That is correct. They're claiming that Taiwan should be under U.S. occupation. And so when it comes to the United States military occupation government of Taiwan, you can look that up. This is where the United States claims that Taiwan is a renegade territory, just as the communist Chinese claim that Taiwan is a renegade province. The United States claims that Taiwan is a renegade territory. It would be similar to Puerto Rico if Puerto Rico suddenly said, we are an independent state and we are not an American territory anymore. So this is where you...
Well, I can tell you what would happen to Puerto Rico if they did that.
Yes, they would invade. They can't do that.
There would not be much of them left.
Yes, that is correct. That is not the case, of course, with...
not what I would like to see happen, but reality is.
Yes, that's right, because sadly the Puerto Ricans don't have the ability to resist that Taiwan has. So just bear that in mind. Taiwan has every means necessary to resist both the United States and communist China. So this is where people become very confused, like, oh, well, what do they have? Yeah, that could take hours to go into, but anyhow, go on.
They have silicon chips.
that is a large factor, and so it's important to bring that up. That certainly is not going to be anything to argue with, and I'll try to explain to people why that has some meaning to it, why that's relevant, because most of them probably will not begin to understand that at all. To most people, Taiwan's status is a geopolitical absurdity. You understand, of course, that Taiwan is not recognized as a legal nation state, yet it's one of the wealthiest nation states on earth with one of the highest qualities of life outside of Japan. Only Japan would be somewhat, they're equal essentially. So just bear that in mind. And Taiwan and Japan both
a much higher standard of living than most of communist China.
Almost all of communist China. This is something that people have a hard time understanding, is just how backwards communist China is, because what you see are, of course, all of communist China's propaganda, and they'll show you they're only going to show you what they consider to be the best, right, of their nation. They're not going to show you. To give you an idea of this, during the Olympics, everybody saw green grass all over communist China. All of that was spray painted. They spray painted all of the grass green, just so people get that. I
remember hearing about that they made people stop driving their cars so the air would clean up.
Oh yeah, and they actually did control the weather. You can control the weather, so do understand that, and so they did that. But because some people are probably wondering about what about the fucking UFOs? Okay, the UFOs basically. The reason that's a factor here, and that'll take us back to the chips. When you take a look at that technology you see in that footage, and everybody asks how long before we can reverse engineer that? Why can't we reverse engineer that? If the Nazis have it, why don't we have it? Understand this: the Germans were far ahead of all the West because they were not racist. Everything you hear about the Third Reich being racist is just pure shit. That's because it's all Allied propaganda from World War II. The Nazis were the most racially tolerant people on earth. Compared to the West, they were basically liberal progressive. And this is why modern reactionary alternative media keeps comparing all of the Antifa and the liberal media to Nazism. There is a reason for that. They keep comparing it to leftist socialism, and this is why Bolsonaro, the Trump of the tropics, when he visited Israel and said, he started claiming, the Nazis were a left-wing movement. Left-wing. I mean, this is how the reactionary radicalized right views Nazism, because the Nazis were centrist. They were radicalized centrist. They were not on either side of the political spectrum. Rather, they were centrist and radicalized at that, and meaning they were proactive and very similar to the Napoleonic concept, but I don't want to go that deep into the ideology. So another program for that. That takes us back into all of the, theoreticals, which we don't need to go into. So in terms of where their practicality, they allied with many non-white powers. Asian India, all of its resistance was Nazified. The Chinese, who ultimately sided with the Axis, with the Japanese. One of the reasons why both communist and nationalist China on Taiwan have a fairly positive memory of Nazism is because Adolf Hitler saved so many Chinese during the Japanese Nanjing massacre. You can look that up. During the Japanese...
That was nasty.
Yes. Well, look up the Japanese Nanjing massacre and look at how the Germans saved so many Chinese. The man who was the entire diplomatic staff, really. They appealed to Adolf Hitler, who sent literally a 1-ton flag. This was a flag so large it weighed a ton. This was a swastika flag, and the Germans call that the Hakenkreuz, or the Hooked Cross. So they put that flag all over an entire district, and that was shelter, because the Japanese would not dare bomb the Hakenkreuz. They would not dare bomb the swastika.
No, they would not bomb that at all.
Yeah, and so all of the Chinese went directly under that flag that could fit under it, and that was how thousands of Chinese were saved by Adolf Hitler. So he's remembered very positively in Asia. And of course, because the Germans were not racist, they took on the technology from the individual, an Asian Indian, who developed the equations that proved that there were black holes. And that was Subramanian Chandrasekhar. So you will probably not even know how to spell that to look that up.
I
But
have heard that name and knew I would not be able to spell.
but take my word on it. Subramanian Chandrasekhar was the man who developed the equations that proved there were black holes. And because of that, he advanced all of astrophysics and consequently all of physics. Once you took that into account, the British rejected him, saying he was just a yellow nigger. And because of that, they rejected his technology. The Nazis took it up and said, this is Die Schwarzen Sonne, the black sun. And they took those black sun equations.
I know that name.
Yes, of course. Of course you do.
Schwarzschild.
Yes. And so they said this is the black sun of that they knew was at the center of the galaxy. And not only that, they took advantage of those equations and they advanced physics by half 100 years. They're at least half 100 years of the rest of the world. That is how they have the technology you see in that footage. Now, of course, in order for you, the Westerners, to recreate that, to reverse engineer that, just take a look at the example of communist China. China had its, on the mainland, communist China had its first nuclear test in 1964. And this, of course, a nuclear fission weapon involves purifying uranium isotopes and getting a critical mass. As I said, the first Soviet test was 1949. And so they helped with some initial research design, production preparations, but they withdrew their support at the last minute, and communist China had to rely on itself to complete the bomb. And the Soviet Union also engaged in test ban negotiations with the United States in 1959. They were forced to do this, of course, because of the Japanese victory in World War II. For those of you who don't understand that, again, read the book, The Roswell Deception, for an in-depth analysis of that. That is what will bring you to an understanding of how the Japanese won the war. And of course, when it came to the Japanese winning the war, a great example of that is the cessation of above ground nuclear testing. This is because of the amount of radiation that was being pumped into the Pacific, where so many of these nuclear tests were conducted. All of that was impacting most immediately the Japanese, and the Japanese gave the order to stop the above ground nuclear testing. This was done through the work of one of Japan's female scientists, who was able to prove with her equations that all of this was impacting Japan. It would therefore impact the rest of the Pacific as well. And because of that, John F. Kennedy. Go on, honey.
What, 3 countries? It was the Americans, the French, and the British were all testing in the South Pacific.
Yes.
And the British eventually moved their testing to Australia, and the United States moved their testing to
Nevada
and Utah. And at first it was all completely above ground. So there are huge swaths of the western United States that are so contaminated that you can't even live there.
That is quite correct. So please bear that in mind. The name of this female scientist, it's very important. Her name was Katsuko Saruhashi. So Katsuko Saruhashi was the woman who proved that the ocean was being radiated. And of course, she was brought to the United States because the Americans were too ignorant to understand the physics of any of this. And she was, of course, confronted by incredible hostility, as you can imagine, because so many Americans above the most top secret levels, the top secret levels where all of you thought that Eisenhower and Truman were communicating with aliens, like you saw in the television series Dark Skies, they were really negotiating with the Japanese, who were quote unquote enemy aliens. And for that reason, many of people in the West thought that these were real aliens, but it was the dehumanization of the Japanese that went back to the internment, which you can look this up. Executive Order 9066 refers to all Japanese as enemy aliens. So basically, what happened was
the ones that had been born here for generations.
Yes, that's right. That's why they were interned. They were enemy by birth, and they were considered completely alien, and therefore all negotiations with the Japanese in the talk-down process were called negotiations with aliens. They were called alien negotiations. And of course, Katsuko Saruhashi, who was the first woman elected to the Science Council of Japan, was basically confronted with, of course, American racism and sexism. She was not allowed to stay anywhere that Americans would live. She was given a hovel, a kind of little wooden cot to live in, just a little cottage, and that was fine with her. She was here to prove her point, and it was proven that her equations were far superior to those of any American scientist, and that the Americans were completely ignorant of anything they were dealing with. They didn't know what the fuck they were doing. And so as a result, John F. Kennedy, who very much was sympathetic to the Japanese, and this was one of the reasons why he was assassinated. For those of you who don't understand, John F. Kennedy was, of course, someone who knew the Japanese were going to win the war. He was someone who basically served during the war, and he was also threatened by his own government at the time. Remember, his brother was killed by FDR. His brother wanted to be the first Irish Catholic. Go on, honey. Yeah.
John Kennedy was killed by FDR, and there was another Kennedy child that was killed in England about the same time frame.
Yes, yes. And don't forget that America was not only completely racist, it was very religiously bigoted. They hated Catholics because they were a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation, and basically because of that,
that came from the majority of the original colonists came from England, and the Roman Catholics who came here came as slaves. Mm-hmm. And that was the way it was set up. Most of the founding families were all Protestants, and the few that weren't were Episcopalian or Anglican, and they were considered to be Protestants until Vatican II.
Yes, yes.
So, my family was part of that exodus from, in our case, Scotland to the United States, and we were among the first Scots to be allowed here because we were Protestants.
Okay. Yes. That's there you have that, and very important to remember, and it is, of course, something that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. Now, remember this: John F. Kennedy, of course, because his brother was running for president, his brother had been confronted by FDR over that fact, or rather, not that his brother was running for president yet, but it was his intentions were well known that he was going to run after the war.
The family plan was for John to be president first, and then Jack, and then Bobby.
Yes.
And Teddy was like an afterthought.
Yes. Yes. Well, you know.
And their father, Joe, had an ongoing relationship with the mafia, which ended up being another key point in Jack's assassination.
Yes. Yes, and the founding father of the Kennedy dynasty was, of course, an Irish bootlegger. He was Irish mafia, and the Irish, yeah, and so because they came from a mafia background, a mob background, because they were Irish, which were considered white niggers, because honestly, all the Anglo-Saxon Protestants had, the entire American Civil War. You don't understand the American Civil War unless you understand it as a white race war between two white races. The blacks were powerless. They had no decision in this other than elements I can bring in later, in another transmission. But in terms of the whites, the northern whites were overwhelmingly Anglo-Teutonic in genetic ancestry, whereas the southern whites were overwhelmingly Gallo-Celtic. They were the French Huguenots who were brought as slaves, who escaped into.
I'll agree with that.
Yes, Louisiana. They were Scottish, Welsh, Irish.
The French in Louisiana were from Canada, and they had been expelled by the
Brits.
British
Yes,
because they were Catholic.
Yes.
So yes, it was very much a I would say religious war, as well as different white ethnic groups. And part of the problem was that they had this setup where the northern states had a goal of this Protestant
I'll
work
put it into perspective for you. Basically, what happened was
Protestant work ethic where they had workmen who needed to be paid, where the South had slaves who didn't.
Yes.
And it became an economic war for that reason, because the slavery situation in the South was undermining the wages for the Northern.
Yes.
And that was the real reason they wanted to get rid of slavery. It had nothing to do with human rights.
Of course. That was one of the factors. The other factor was it was a continuity of the Anglo desire to completely exterminate the remnants of the Celtic race. The British for hundreds of years had been trying to exterminate the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh. And this was simply a carryover across the Atlantic of that genocidal mentation and the desire to culminate, to conclude that genocidal campaign against the Celtic race in the South by the Anglo-North. The Anglo-Dutch Teutonic North, Anglo-Dutch, mostly the Teutonism was of a Dutch variety.
You have to understand that even today, the largest ethnic group in the United States is Germanic.
Of course, and they hate themselves. They're indoctrinated into self-loathing.
50 million Americans have German descent.
Yes, and they are indoctrinated from the moment they're raised to play video games where they kill Germans. They're indoctrinated by film to hate Germans. They hate themselves. This is why you can't trust Americans. They hate themselves. They hate their German roots and heritage. They hate themselves, and they don't worship Christ. They don't follow Christ. Rather, they worship the Jew. To them, the Jew is God, because to them, the Jew is the people of God. And so they mistake the Jew for God. This is why in films where you have people like, that lovely Serbian chick, Mila Jovovich, who plays in all of the Resident Evil. She played Joan of Arc. And in the Joan of Arc film, where she's playing Joan of Arc, when she meets God, he's Dustin Hoffman, which is just a Jew. Well, look at God. He's this old Jew. He looks like Yoda. That's the Jews. That's the God of Americans. So the Americans, their God is the Jew. This is why when you had someone like Roman Polanski, who raped a underage girl here in the United States, and of course committed that crime, he had to go into exile in France. He came back to America to open up a Holocaust Memorial Museum in New York. And the police were not allowed to arrest him because the mobs were so violent, the police would be overwhelmed. So they had to let him open up a Holocaust museum in New York, a known pedophile, after which he went back to France completely unmolested because, of course, he's Jewish. And this is how the Americans worship the Jew. They can get away with raping children in America and do whatever they will. That is the American way.
It.
Yes. So that being said, Kennedy, of course, his brother was confronted by FDR. His brother was killed. Kennedy knew that FDR would kill him too if he remained on the field of battle. He wanted to get out of the field of battle as soon as he could. An opportunity presented itself on the night of August 2nd through the 3rd of 1943. And that's when the Amagiri, one of the finest class of destroyers in the world, had been reduced to escorting troop convoys to the beleaguered Japanese garrison on Kolam Bangara. And then what had happened, she sighted the PT-109, which was Kennedy's boat. And she ordered ram speed. The captain who ordered that was, of course, Lieutenant Commander Kuhei Hanami. And what happened was that Kennedy ordered, he had made a murder-suicide pact with his engine man. And the engine man, rather than starting the engines at the moment that the destroyer was sighted, the Amagiri, the only ship to have ever sank a vessel skippered by a future American president, once that was sighted, yeah. Kennedy gave that order, and what happened was his engine man stalled the engines. And that's a fact, because it was impossible for what happened to happen otherwise. And that's when they were cut in half by the Japanese destroyer, and Kennedy got out of the war through his injuries and, of course, saved what many could. They swam for miles, and when they got to shore, Kennedy made certain all the survivors lived. He was able to get out of the war as a hero, and when he was sworn in as president, he made certain that, and you can see this in the photographs, when he's taken the oath of office on that Bible, one of the men right next to him is the Japanese destroyer commander, Lieutenant Commander Kuhei Hanami, who was there invited by Kennedy personally because he knew without that man, he would never have gotten out of the war alive because FDR would have found some way to kill him in combat and have it written off, just like he did his brother. And that was the only way he could live.
That's interesting. I didn't know that detail.
Oh, yes. And because of that, the U.S. Bomber Command, the Strategic Air Command, commanded, of course, by all of the madmen. It was, oh my God, who was the guy who was in charge of the Bomber Mafia is what they called it. And there is a book out by that title that is highly recommended. And that is where, of course, you encounter these madmen who were to form the American Strategic Air Command. And so you've got all of these lunatics that were running this mass genocidal operation. And because of that, they took control of America's concept of warfare, so that General Curtis LeMay, who was the United States' counterpart to the madman known as Bomber Harris in England. And if you ever look up Bomber Harris in England, you'll find out that the British refused to ever honor him or build any statues in his likeness, because even the British know he was a genocidal maniac. Here in America, nobody's developed that concept about Curtis LeMay. But Curtis LeMay confronted John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis and called him a traitor because he knew what had happened in World War II. And he felt that Kennedy was working for the Japs. And the reason he felt that was because of America basically saying this Japanese female scientist is right and all of you are wrong. He said Katsuko Saruhashi is smarter than any American scientist. And she's proven that if we keep testing these bombs, we're all going to die. We're going to poison the entire Pacific, and we'll all pay the price for that. So I am going to stop above ground nuclear testing. The arms race be damned. And that's when the Soviets said, well, we have to stop too, because basically the Japanese had won the war. Remember, the Soviets were still at war with Japan. They are still at war with Japan today as the Russians. You can look this up yourself. Japan and Russia, in case you didn't know, and here's a little more of the Asian geopolitics here, there are 3 ongoing wars in Asia. My native nation, Taiwan, is legally at war with communist China. South Korea is legally at war with North Korea. Japan is legally at war with the goddamn Russians. The fucking Russians are still at war with Japan. But because the Japanese won the war against all the rest of the allies, including Russia, who they staved off from invading Japan itself, and you can find out the details of that in the Roswell Deception for in-depth discussion and details, basically the Japanese fucking had the world in a socket. So when they said stop the goddamn testing, Kennedy was the first to say, we will stop. And then everyone pretty much said, yes, we'll stop too. And because of that, then Bomber Harris, excuse me, that's the Brits. In this case, it was that madman of the bomber mafia, Curtis LeMay. He said to Kennedy that you're a fucking traitor. And he said several times, Kennedy needs to die. And this was what Kennedy got together with that Frank Sinatra. And Kennedy, you can look this up yourself. Don't take my word for it. Kennedy helped to make the film The Manchurian Candidate. He gave the go-ahead for filming The Manchurian Candidate because Kennedy said, the military is going to kill me. He said, the military is going to kill me. And he made certainty, he made home films with Jackie Kennedy as the starlet and himself as the star, in which he was dying and killed by the military. He had the Secret Service pretending to be the military killing because he knew that he wanted evidence there that when I'm taken out, I want people to know it was the military. And it was the Strategic Air Command because he had stopped all the nuclear testing. They considered him a traitor to the Japanese Empire. They knew what had happened in World War II. They knew the Japanese destroyer commander was there at his swearing-in ceremony. They knew he followed the advice of the Japanese scientists, and they considered the Japanese to be enemy aliens, the alien race, the enemy aliens. And of course, they said, our president has to fucking die. That's your Strategic Air Command. And he said it would be the military. That's why he was behind the making of The Manchurian Candidate. The Manchurian Candidate was released right after his assassination, and it was never shown again for 100 years. And of course, yes. And he was locked away in a safe after that until on the death of Frank Sinatra, the estate finally released it again, and you can view it today. When you watch that, make certain you look up the facts that Kennedy was behind that. Kennedy gave his go-ahead on that because they never would have made a film like that. It would have been too disrespectful to the president in those days without his permission. And that brings us back, of course, to the atomic bomb situation. And when you get back to making a bomb, reverse engineering a bomb, as I said, when the Soviet Union was engaged in the test ban negotiations with the United States in 1959, that directly inhibited the delivery of any prototype to communist China. And the broader disagreements between the Soviet and Chinese communist ideologies escalated the mutual criticism, and the Soviets responded by withdrawing the delivery of a prototype bomb, and over 1,400 Russian advisors and technicians involved in no less than 200 scientific projects in communist China that had been meant to foster cooperation between the two red giants. And at that time, the only thing, basically remember this, the original United Nations, the Security Council of the United Nations, this organization of war developed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, headquartered the War Department of the United Nations in the Presidio military base of San Francisco. You can fucking look this up. The United Nations was established at the Presidio military base of San Francisco, where I worked, so I know what I'm talking about. That United Nations declared the Axis to be its eternal enemy. It has no purpose without the Axis existing. Another factor in their Cold War with my native Taiwan, the last Axis power on Earth. And the fact is that the United Nations has another factor in not invading Taiwan, and that is the Thousand-Year Reich in exile, which is their ally. Mm-hmm. So the point is that when it comes to the United Nations, basically It was established January 1st, 1942, just a few weeks and a few days after Pearl Harbor in December 7th of 1941 and that attack. And the United Nations had a Security Council. Now, the first member of that Security Council was Nationalist China. The Nationalist Chinese had been the first nation to take up arms against the Axis. Understand this.
Wasn't that under Chiang Kai-shek?
Yes, yes. And it was due to the Marco Polo Bridge incident, as Americans understand it. The Liu Gao Bridge incident in China, no American could pronounce that, so they just called it Marco Polo. So Americans could, oh, it must be in Asia. Yeah. So the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which you can look up, that was the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. And the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War became World War II with the Nanjing Massacre, which was, of course, in December 12th, 11th through the 13th of 1937. The Marco Polo Bridge incident was on July 7th of 1937. 7/7/37. And so that was what started the Second Sino-Japanese War. Then what happened was the Japanese and Chinese were going to make a peace. You can read all about this in the Roswell Deception, www.skybooksusa.com. What happened was the Chinese and the Japanese were going to make a peace with each other on December 11th of 1941. The American Marine Corps, which you can look this up, was commanded in theater, China Command, by a rabid communist, Evans Fortis Carlson of the United States Marine Corps, Carlson Raiders fame, was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. When he was buried in the United States, the Soviet Union sent an entire group of dignitaries to make certain he was buried with Soviet medals on his chest, and they made certain to play the Soviet national anthem while he was lowered into the ground. He was a communist hero. He operated with the communist Chinese.
But he was a Marine.
He was an American general, general of the United States Marine Corps. People who don't get it, the entire United States Marine Corps was communized. You can read all about it in the Roswell Deception and the Demystification of World War II. Most Americans have no idea of this. They were so communized that Harry Truman said, they're the enemy. Harry Truman got up and he said that the United States Marine Corps has a better propaganda machine than Joseph Stalin. That is a quote you can look up. And he tried to disband the Marine Corps, and then they tried to kill him. Understand that. Your military kills your presidents. You live under a constant threat of military coup d'etat and junta.
Well, I knew that somebody was threatening presidents.
Oh, yes.
They will talk about something until they're elected, and then suddenly they do same old shit.
Yes, that is right. So what had happened was that the assassins tried to take out Harry Truman. You can look this up, and they said they were a bunch of Puerto Rican nationalists. They said, oh, a bunch of Puerto Rican separatists tried to kill Harry Truman. And that was just 2 weeks before the 1950 congressional elections, when this hit squad of purported Puerto Rican nationalists stormed Blair House, where Truman was residing while the White House was being renovated. Now, during that period, no one but the military was aware of the first family's relocation during those repairs. Now, the assassination attempt failed, but a White House policeman who was stationed outside was killed, and another was grievously injured in this fusillade, this military fusillade that engulfed the Blair House lobby. Now, had the assassins waited just another 20 minutes, they would have killed Harry Truman and his entire family. The only thing that saved the 33rd president of the United States was the fact that his car, which he was driving his family home in, had a tire blowout on the way home. And that's why he got out of the car, being the man that he was, to repair the tire himself. And he jacked the car up, took a spare out of the trunk, and repaired that himself. And he did it all in 20 minutes and got home 20 minutes late. If that had not happened, he and his entire family would have been wiped out by the United States Marine Corps. That's your fucking Marine Corps for you. And so they, of course, were just atrocious in their communization. This is why he wanted them disbanded. They were the enemy and still are. And your United States Marine Corps was over there in China, and they were operating with Mao Zedong. You can look this up yourself. Carlson, Evans Fortis Carlson, who's most famous for developing the United States Marine Corps K-bar knife. And this individual who pioneered Carlson's Raiders, that's all based on communist Chinese fighting tactics, guerrilla fighting styles he learned from Mao Zedong. You can look that up yourself. Don't take my word for it. And so he worked so hand in glove with the communist Chinese that what happened was when the nationalist Chinese and the Japanese were making peace on December 11th of 1937, the Americans dressed as rice paddy farmers in black pajamas and the black coolie hats, what you would recognize today as VC or Viet Cong. The Americans first pioneered those ink-blackened Chinese uniforms. They stormed that peace treaty and massacred everyone. And the Japanese retaliated with the Nanjing Massacre. And while they were conducting the massacre, they were interrogating hundreds of Chinese, and they found out that these people who stormed the peace process, which they thought was a Chinese betrayal, were all white. And they said, well, British are American, because the British and the Americans were both operating in China at the time. And no Chinese could tell them apart. They said just white. They were speaking English. Well, what kind of English? The King's English or the President's English? They couldn't tell the difference any more than an American could tell the difference between various Chinese dialects or the fact that certain Koreans, Taiwanese, Okinawans, Chinese worked with the Imperial Japanese Army, and they all spoke Japanese. Americans couldn't tell them apart. To them, they were all gooks, just as to a Japanese or Chinese, all the Scots, Irish, or Welsh all speak English, and they couldn't tell them apart from the Brits. So what the Japanese did was they retaliated by bombing both the British and American flagships in China. And on the rivers, those were their primary gunboats, the USS Panay and the HMS Lady Bird. So His Majesty's ship, the Lady Bird, and the United States ship, the Panay, were sunk on December 13th of 1937. That was what started World War II. That's when World War II went global. At that point, America and Great Britain were at war with Japan in theater of China. And it was like the Vietnam War. It was undeclared, but everybody knew it. My father was a U.S. sailor in the gunboat patrols in China, and he remembers going home on leave, and all Americans would say, how's the war with the Japs? Just the same way they would casually ask, how's the war in Korea or how's the war in Vietnam? And of course, at the same time, there were signs on everybody's lawn that said, sailors and dogs keep off the grass. You know, and only with Pearl Harbor did the military suddenly become heroes. And so this was the geopolitics of Asia at the time. And what happened was, at that point with Pearl Harbor, legal war was declared. But the reason the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor was because the Americans were going to bomb Japan from China using American planes painted in Chinese colors and sporting Chinese national symbols, so that it would look like the Chinese had attacked Japan.
Yeah,
all of the reality of this. Go on,
something about that.
Yes. Yes. Well, I'm the one who exposed that.
No, I remember hearing something about that when I was a child in school. Something about somebody's raiders were painting American planes to
the Flying Tigers.
Flying Tigers, that they were doing that.
Yes. And Flying Tigers had a bomber command. Yeah.
Back in the 60s, California public schools were much more forthcoming with actual facts than they are now.
Thank you. Thank you, honey. And that's very important. And that's because many people knew this who were older. They lived through it. They remembered there was war before Pearl Harbor. And so you had people like that who were still able to relate the truth. Other people, succeeding generations, had all of it indoctrinated out of them. So very important to remember all this context. And then you go back to the atomic bombs And so there was Soviet and Chinese spying to uncover atomic secrets. Of course, this was a high priority effort to copy critical weapons technology. Now, 20 years with a lot of help, constant spying for information, and a common base of science and technology. And still, China did not have a strategic bomber until the year 2007, the year my father, the man who raised and guided me, George Joseph Henry Dietrich, Chief Petty Officer of the United States Navy, God rest his soul, that was when he died. And China had assistance with bomber technology from the Soviets. Russians had stolen aviation technology, as had the Chinese, along with information from the USA. And China also acquired airplane technology from European suppliers. The United States had a long-range strategic bomber in 1942. The 4-engine B-29 had 3,200 miles of range, 5.4 tons of bomb payload over 1,400 nautical miles. And the B-52 had a combat range of 4,000 miles. And now it's 8,800 miles with improvements and refueling, along with 30 tons of bomb payload. The 2007 Chinese, communist Chinese, the correct term is CHICOM for Chinese Communist in the acronym. The 2007 CHICOM Xi'an H-6 bomber had a range of 3,200 nautical miles and only a 12-ton payload. It took 52 fucking years for the Chinese to get close to the B-52. So bear in mind that China emerged from isolation in 1978, had to engage with the world and catch up with technology. So you might ask, how is it that these primitives were considered a superpower? There was only one reason. Remember that when the United Nations was formed, the United Nations Security Council had 5 nations on it. There are still only 5 nations on the inner Security Council of the United Nations. There are, of course, the Allied powers: Russia, America, Britain, France, and what was originally my own nationalist China, which, of course, under Chiang Kai-shek, was the first to fight the Axis nations, the Japanese, in 1937. So what happened was the Americans, under the Marine Corps influence, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was infatuated with communism and but a pawn of Joseph Stalin, these said, let's support the communist Chinese. And because Chiang Kai-shek and my people were betrayed, in 1945, we switched to the Axis. That's why we're the last Axis power on the surface of the earth. And if you read the United Nations Charter, Title 42, they say this war is against Hitlerism. So all the Axis powers were defined by Hitlerianism in the same manner that World War Zero, or the first global war of the Napoleonic Wars, was considered, and you can look this up, a war not against France, but a war declared against the individual person of Napoleon Bonaparte. So too, World War II.
That was why he was exiled and poisoned.
Yes, and this is why in World War II, they considered this a war against the individual person of Adolf Hitler. And so the Taiwanese today are considered by the United Nations definition Hitlerians, the last Hitlerians on the surface of the earth, my people. So it took the Soviets 7 years to reverse engineer the US B-29 bomber, not because they're smarter, but because they had so many white people who could easily infiltrate the white United States and steal their secrets so much more effectively, much more difficult for the communist Chinese. Now,
the communist Chinese went on these regular vendettas against their own people. They would take all of the intelligentsia, which would include the scientists, and make them go work in the fields. And since they weren't used to that kind of work, most of them died. And so when you're going every 10 years or so and killing off your scientists, it makes it real hard to copy somebody else's technology.
Yes. So hopefully that gives people some limited perspective. We have very little time left. I'll cover everything that I can. so that
We
people
have
get a better.
about half hour left. Yeah.
Yes, and we'll have to continue this in our next interview. But this is so important for understanding, what's going on and exactly why all of this is impacting you. Exactly how this is impacting you. That brings us back to, again, the example of technology. Copying the wide-body commercial jets has been far more difficult because there are metallurgical advances that need to be integrated. There are complex engines. There are electronics. China has had economic catch-up, but has not been able to make competitive jet engines and cannot make a competitive wide-body jet. And chip technology is very difficult to copy. There are complex lithography machines to be created. There is design software and production software. If it was to be created from scratch, then there has to be all of the previous generations of lithography to build the improved computers and equipment to enable the next generation.
And then we're back to under
Taiwan.
Mao, they would go back through and purge the people who actually knew how to do that.
Yes, yes. So
once Mao died, they had to rebuild that part of their culture. Now, I want Americans to understand China was a 5,000-year-old culture. It was civilized where these people were civilized at their core. This was not like Americans that have a veneer of civilization and you can go out in the boonies and be as primitive as you want to be. These were civilized people with a culture that could read documents going back 5,000 years.
Yes, it was the most advanced civilization on Earth for much of the Earth's history. Bear that in mind.
And Mao destroyed that.
Yes, that he was a large part of that colonialism before him. But what happened with China was they were too civilized. What happened was the Chinese were the first to develop gunpowder. And what happened was that they realized under the imperial decree that if this led to an arms race, this would lead to weapons that would ultimately have the potential to destroy the world. And so they outlawed the use of gunpowder in war and for violence. They made certain that gunpowder was reserved for spiritual warfare, meaning the firecrackers that would scare away demons and devils and spiritual dark forces. And because of that, the barbarians took that gunpowder and turned it into weapons with which they destroyed China. That is the problem of being too civilized. They were overwhelmed by a white barbarian invasion. The white savages took over China. So today, say, for instance, if you're trying to reverse engineer Reich's technology of the 1,000-year Reich in exile, if there's no factories or spying possible, like copying this quote-unquote alien technology, then a copier would need to create a lithography industry to make chips. So obviously, it took China until 1988 to enter the satellite launching business with a capable rocket. China's rocket did not get reliable until after 1996. The U.S. had a government contracted launch program starting the year my sister was born, 1963, to launch commercial satellites. China has been about half 100 years behind developments in the U.S. space program, even though the basic science and technology were universal. So
that's how long Mao was in power.
Yes, thank you. And this is why the American allies, the Anglo-American allies, being the bigoted racists that they are, unlike the Reich, and unable to absorb Asian science, became half 100 years behind the Third Reich, which is now in exile in Unterland and far ahead of your capabilities to reverse engineer. So that helps to put that Asian reality into perspective. This is the secret military technology and operation scenario. So if you think it's difficult to see how technology for 600 G acceleration and 0 to 13,000 mile per hour movement could have been secretly developed in America, and yet now you know it's the Third Reich technology simply ahead of your own. That's how difficult it is to copy chip technology out of Taiwan.
Mhm.
There are complex lithography machines to be created. There's a design software and production software. If it was to be created from scratch, then there has to be all of those previous generations. And the global supply of semiconductors emerged as a full-blown crisis from the start of this year, with the chip shortage snarled everything from phone to cars, from TVs to smartphones. Everyone in the tech industry was affected by it. We are in a semiconductor crisis right now, and it's a very pervasive one. Initially, the problem was thought to be only a temporary delay as factories shut down when the pandemic first hit. But after production resumed, changing consumer habits, again affected by this pandemic, led to a surge in demand. Everybody's at home. They got nothing to do but watch TV, use their computers, call each other on the phone, and producers are finding it impossible to fulfill that demand. At first, it was the
And
laptop.
I just made that worse because I bought a server.
There you are, honey. Yes. So first it was the laptop and smartphone producers, then it was the TVs, now it's the cars, and the chip shortage keeps getting worse.
It's
And
not just the cars. You've got refrigerators, microwaves, anything electrical in your house is now on the Internet of Things, and all of those require chips.
Yes, and of course, it's the semiconductor crisis is now particularly acute in affecting auto manufacturers, forcing car makers to strip out all their high-tech features. And as the cars are becoming increasingly smart, car manufacturers are finding themselves caught in this crisis. Now, some like Tesla have, well, they secured reliable supply lines by relocating to communist China. Now, that is the kind of problem that you have. And so basically, to drive this.
Elon Musk isn't even American, he's South African.
Oh, there you go. Yes. And of course, everybody asks, can't we just make more? You see the crunch?
Well, you can, but you have to have the underlying technology to produce these things. And the only places that are making them is Silicon Valley in California and Taiwan. And the ones from Taiwan are better quality. And there is a limited supply of the elements required to make them, and most of them are in countries that are using child slave labor to mine.
Yes, in fact, the biggest country for the source of rare metals is communist China. But America has those rare earth elements, except America has totally deindustrialized. In order to access those rare earth elements again, with our present environmental safety standards, unless we just go all out and completely destroy our environment, it will take another 10 years, 20. Realistically 10 years if we go full speed ahead, but nobody's doing that. And
that was the rationale for staying in Afghanistan as long as they did, was the rare earth minerals in Afghanistan.
Oh, that's a joke.
So we were going to butcher another country rather
but they never got around to it.
Mine our own.
Right, but they never got around to that. There was never enough. Yeah.
Of course not, because all they were doing there, in practical terms, was raising opium.
Yes, they were doing nothing to develop infrastructure or create an economy. So yes, so basically, just so people understand,
we don't create anymore. We just go in and
rape.
We extort and intimidate.
Yes,
that's all we do.
Yes,
that's all we know how to do anymore.
Right. By the way, a shout out to Crystal River. Wonderful lady is telling me to calm down, and my blood pressure's going up, she says. And, so love you, honey.
Your voice kind of sounds that way, yeah.
Yeah. So understand this much when it comes to the complications of chip manufacturing. Manufacturing a chip typically takes more than 3 months, and it involves enormous factories, dust-free rooms, multi-million-dollar machines, molten tin, and lasers. And the end goal is to transform wafers of silicon, this element extracted from plain sand, into a network of billions of tiny switches called transistors that form the basis of the circuitry that will eventually give a phone, a computer, a car, a washing machine, or a satellite their crucial capabilities. It is the most complex small thing you can imagine. Chips are
And there are billions of transistors in a single
chip.
phone.
Yes. Yes, they're groups of
In
circuits.
a single phone.
Yes.
There are
Yes.
billions. So
Yes.
we're not talking you can do one at a time.
Yes.
You have to
Yes.
have capability here.
Yes. Yes. And understand when it comes to the rare metals, of course, as I mentioned, China has a monopoly only because they were willing to strip their country and destroy their environment in order to get these materials. Japan has those materials, and they're all underneath the Pacific Ocean off Marcus Island, but they too have a monopoly in the event of emergency. They will go all out balls to the wall and colonize the seafloor if they have to get that. But they're not producing chips. And the people who are producing chips are South Korea and Taiwan. So these chips, of course, they're groups of circuits that run software, manipulate data, control the functions of electronic devices, and it's the arrangement of those circuits that give them their specific purpose. And of course, the chip companies try to pack more transistors into chips to enhance performance and make the devices more power efficient. And so you could go into the details of that, but this first one was from California. It was Intel's first microprocessor, the 4004. It was released in 1971. It was only 2,300 transistors with a node size of 10 microns, or 10 millionth of a meter. But Intel's undisputed leadership of the following decades between 2015 and 2020 collapsed when my native Taiwan, with Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company and South Korea's Samsung Electronics Company, started building chips with much better transistors. Ones with dimensions down to 5 nanometers, or 5 billionths of a meter. So for comparison,
we're talking there in the molecular sizes range.
Yes, submolecular. For comparison, an average human hair is 100,000 nanometers wide. I mean, this is far cleaner than surgery. Before you put silicon into chip making machines, you need a clean room. You need a very clean room, because individual transistors are many times smaller than a virus. Just one speck of dust.
When I was in college, I was studying viruses and using an electron microscope. So, you know, I the size ranges you're talking about, I'm familiar with.
Thank you. And so just one speck of dust can cause havoc and millions of dollars of wasted effort. To mitigate this risk, chip makers house their machines in rooms that essentially have no dust. And each dust particle is counted as anything less than 200 nanometers, a billionth of a meter in size. And to maintain that environment, the air is constantly filtered, and very few people are ever allowed in. If more than one or two workers ever appear on a chip production line, wrapped head to toe in protective equipment, that's a sign something's very wrong. And so,
it means they're in there to fix something.
Yes, the real geniuses behind semiconductor design and development work miles away. And even with all those precautions, the wafers of silicon can never be touched by humans or ever exposed to the air. They travel between machines in cartridges carried by robots that run on tracks in the ceiling, and they only emerge from the safety of those cartridges when they're inside the machines, and it's time for the other key step in the process, atomic level manufacturing. And without going into all the details of that, this is what brings us to the burdensome economics. Chip plants run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they do that for one reason: cost. Building an entry-level factory that produces 50,000 wafers per month costs about 15 billion United States dollars. And most of this is spent on specialized equipment, a market that exceeds $60 billion in sales for the first time was around 2020, but yesteryear. And the sales of equipment used in chip manufacturing have doubled since 2015. But there's three companies. Intel, Intel is California, which is America's economy. California is America's economy.
Yeah.
All you idiots out there who say get rid of California because of the politics, you get rid of California and you are shit. You are nothing.
Exactly.
There's
nothing. California has been supporting the rest of the country for
Forever.
at least 50 years.
Yes, all of you need us. You should be kissing our fucking asses. And in terms of Samsung, that's South Korea, and the rest of the world, it's TSMC. That's Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company Limited. It's actually Taiwan Jiti Jianlu Jijiao Yufan Yujian Gongxi, or simply Taiwan Semiconductor. And our factories are more advanced, and they cost over 20 billion United States dollars each. This year, TSMC will spend as much as 28 billion US dollars on new plants and equipment. Compare that to the United States government's attempt to pass a bill supporting domestic chip production, and that legislation would offer just 50 billion US dollars over 5 fucking years, like a Soviet 5-year plan. You have nothing on Taiwan.
Congress has no clue.
No, you don't. And once you spend,
costs, and they don't spend it on where it needs to be, they give it away to everybody else.
Yes, and once you spend all that money, that $50 billion over your Soviet 5-year plan in the United States, building giant facilities, they become obsolete in 5 years, actually less. So to avoid
obsolescence is now at about 2 years.
Yes, to avoid losing money, the chip makers must generate 3 billion US dollars in profit from each plant. So now only the biggest companies, in particular the top 3 I mentioned, that combined generate 188 billion United States dollars in revenue just last year, can afford to build these multiple plants. It's a big fish industry. And so Intel of California, Samsung of South Korea, and TSMC of my native Taiwan generated almost as much revenue in 2020 as the next 12 largest chip makers combined. And the more you do this, the better you get at it. Yield, which is the percentage of chips that aren't discarded, that's the key measure. Anything less than 90% is a problem. But chip makers only exceed that level by learning expensive lessons over and over again and building on that knowledge. Now, the brutal economics of the industry mean fewer companies can afford to keep up. And most of the roughly 1.4 billion smartphone processors shipped each year are made by Taiwan Semiconductor. So Intel has 80% of the market for computer processors, and South Korea's Samsung dominates in memory chips. And for everyone else, including the Empire of Japan and Communist China on the mainland, it's not even easy for them to break in. Hopefully that gives you some of the geopolitics of what's going on. Everyone wants Taiwan. And Japan says it will go to war over Taiwan. And so
does Japan still have an army?
Oh God, honey. Honey, oh my God. I love you dearly, but oh my God, that's such an American question. Oh my God.
The lie here is that they disarmed.
Oh my God. Oh God. Not only is Japan not only does it have an army, it's a first-rate nuclear power, okay? You can look this up yourself. So everybody look this up. Look up the scandal of American nuclear waste that was going to Japan so that the Japanese could build nuclear weapons. The Japanese, because they won World War II, said, give us your fucking nuclear waste, your spent fuel rods, so we can build a bunch of nuclear weapons. I mean, aside from all the waste they produce from their own nuclear fucking power plants, which they've got because we've all heard of Fukushima Daiichi. Go on, honey. I'm sorry?
Fukushima Daiichi was not the only one that they had, not by any.
Yeah, there were other nuclear incidents. Yes.
I knew they had nuclear power plants,
Yeah.
but the lie told over here was that they disarmed after World War II.
Oh no, God no, not at all. They're one of the most.
That's the cultural excuse for still having our military there.
Oh, the military is in Okinawa, which is a different culture, a different ethnos. They're an entirely different race, and they fly their own flag. People can look this up.
My nephew's in Tokyo, and he's in the military.
Yeah, and that's because the Americans are leasing their bases from the Japanese. They pay for it. They have to pay the Japanese. And not only that, by Japanese law, the Japanese military chain of command supersedes the American chain of command in Japan. That is by Japanese law. You can look that up. I'm sure if your son looks that up, he can realize that, so that people understand that. Bear in mind, when I say the Japanese won the war, I mean they won the war. America is there specifically only on sufferance because it pays to be there. The Okinawans down in Okinawa want them out as soon as possible. They hate the Americans with every reason.
I've heard enough reports about American soldiers raping the locals that I can understand them wanting them out.
Yes, thank you, honey. And just profoundly important, something that almost nobody knows about in their ignorance. But yes, believe me when I'm telling you this, you have no idea just how, just how little you know. But then that's why I'm here as one of the experts on Asia to tell you how little you know. I'm hoping that...
Well, I'm at the point where I realize probably 99.9% of what I have been taught by American schools were lies.
Yes.
What I was taught in Shula has turned out to be 90% correct and 10% propaganda.
Yes.
What
yes.
I was taught in California public schools is the other way around, 10% truth and 90% propaganda.
So understand
that
this.
That was in the 60s.
Yes. So understand this. And I'm not trying to be condescending to our lovely Penny here. I'm saying this to all of you. While the United States propagandizes a profoundly anti-nuclear Japan, the Empire of Japan has not only long possessed everything necessary to and on standby to construct nuclear weapons, but has had such an arsenal of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic fucking missiles, okay? Intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, not just MRBMs, medium-range ballistic missiles, or SRBMs, short-range ballistic missiles, but intercontinental, okay? It's been operational since the year the Japanese victory was acknowledged in 1952. Again, you can look up the book, skybooks.usa.com, The Roswell Deception and the Demystification of World War II, and get all of the dirt on the fact that the peace with Japan, the San Francisco Peace Treaty, was signed by the Americans, which was their surrender, effectively their surrender to Japan in 1952. That's when it went into effect on the emperor's birthday as a gift to the emperor who won the war. And he was the only World War II leader to live forever, outliving all World War II leaders: Roosevelt, Truman, Charles de Gaulle, Mussolini, Joseph Stalin, the only Churchill. The only man who survived forever was Hirohito. And so 1953, they went full intercontinental nuclear arsenal. And they were acting decisively and drawing down proactive hostilities as contemporaneously pursued by the Sino-Soviet communist bloc on the Korean Peninsula at that time. 1953 was when the Soviets and the Communist Chinese were forced to have their own surrender by drawing the line at the demilitarized zone and maintaining a ceasefire. The war ended proactively, even though it's flared up all the time since then. It's maintained an overall ceasefire on the demilitarized zone, even though North Korea and South Korea are still legally at war, and Japan and Russia are still legally at war. And the United States, because it lost the war, had to circumvent all its own laws to help Japan accumulate tons of plutonium. And I use the term nuclear waste just jokingly. The United States deliberately allowed Japan to access America's most secret nuclear weapons facilities, while it transferred tens of billions of dollars worth of American tax-paid research that has allowed Japan to amass 70 tons of weapons-grade plutonium since the 1980s. You can look this up yourself. It's a national security scandal.
Well, I knew it in
the communist Chinese,
1988 or 89, that all of NATO started using depleted uranium for shell casings.
Yes,
and
that's nuclear waste.
That's why that was the ultimate cause of Gulf War syndrome.
Yes,
that every country NATO has fought in since then has become so radioactive that the women are being told to not have babies.
Honey, the Americans and the Brits radioactivated themselves. Utah and is downwind from Nevada, and the buried Goldwater test range, where the buried Goldwater, they named a test range after him for all this shit, and everybody who's downwind of that wound up getting all kinds of birth defects, radiation diseases. In Britain, it's Solway Firth, where they were testing depleted uranium, and everybody there is born with mutations and two heads and shit.
Fallujah is having those problems, and the women there were told to not have kids. Serbia is complaining about those problems.
Of course. Yeah, but at least everybody can take some.
Libya is having similar issues.
Yeah, of course. But everyone can take some grim satisfaction that the Americans and the Brits are doing just the same to themselves. Anyhow, the communist Chinese, whom the Japanese counterbalance, have always known about this. And the Japanese nuclear deterrent force exists. And it's fairly common knowledge, even in the United States military and intelligence circles. And so Japan's ICBM force amounts to about a dozen or so pinpoint targeted supermassive missiles of mega destruction, high accuracy missile systems carrying 10 nuclear warheads each, with nuclear yields assessed at as 750 kilotons to a megaton. And it's deployed around the iconic Mount Fujiyama-sama, or Mount Fuji, mostly on the reverse slope away from China, to complicate nuclear strikes by missiles that the communist Chinese use, which are confined to ballistic trajectories. So just so you know this, and so the Japanese have this. So when you talk about nuclear power staring each other in the eye, Russia is irrelevant. Russia can only conduct dirty war. All it can do is software, ransomware attacks, propaganda, biological weapons that it unleashes on the cheap. The Russians prepared for it by making giant pig factories where they've bred supergiant pigs. You can look this fucking up. The Russians have bred pigs the size of horses so that they could, because the Africanized swine fever that they produced, they made certain all their pigs were isolated, bred to the size of horses so they could feed more people with a single slaughter. And they basically have these cow-sized pigs they maintain in multi-story concrete skyscrapers that are nothing but pigs on top of pigs. And they produce huge lagoons of pig shit that are just uninhabitable to any humanity. No humanity can live in the area because it's literally as toxic as nuclear waste. And
there are pig farms in California. Yes, I know the smell.
Yeah,
the stench.
Yeah, and you can imagine what those in Russia are like. And Russia was trying to monopolize the pig industry so they could finally have power over China, which otherwise is simply going to absorb them. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is why the Russians unleashed the African swine fever to destroy China's food supply, because otherwise China was going to absorb Russia as simply a satellite state, because Russia does not have anywhere near the population to resist China. Russia's population is dying. It's declining. Its demography is all suicides and children on drugs and people who see no future, because there is no future. Russia has no economy. They have no technology. They have nothing to offer the world but war. That's all they have. All they produce.
That's where the United States is now, too.
Yeah. Yes. But
We
Russia,
have nothing to offer the world,
but war. Yeah, but there's a difference. The United States can project its threat. It can project its military. The Russians cannot. The Russians can only stick to the closest logistical lines, like Syria. Syria, if it practically borders Russia, that's the only place they can go into, is places like that. They can't provoke anywhere else in the world, so they're stuck with their software reach and ransomware attacks and demanding payments in crypto coinage. Which is why we have to outlaw crypto coinage, cryptocurrency. That's simply a tool for Russian ransomware attacks. And so they, of course, thought that they could get back at China, maintain their power by control of the food supply with their supergiant bred pigs. All of this is real. You can look all of this up. Giant Russian pigs, weaponized African swine fever, the fact that Chinese have been deprived of food. This is what's forced them out into the South China Sea to drain the seas dry, to dredge them of all the seafood that they can to feed their population. This is what brings them into direct conflict with everyone else. Russia has therefore started us on the road to world war. And all the target of everyone, Japan, China, and America, is my native Taiwan. That should put some perspective for everyone into the politics of East Asia today, and Taiwan can defend itself. There's a reason for this, and we can go into that in another transmission. But Taiwan has its own superpower, and in terms of everything else, hopefully, honey, was that coherent? Did that give you a good enough?
That was coherent, and thank you very much. And you stopped right on time. Thank you so much for coming.
I love you. Thank you. Okay, so there we are.